Hello everyone, and welcome back. There are stories in human history that begin not with kings, monuments, or battles, but with something far quieter. Before walls, before writing, before even the idea of nations, human life unfolded close to the earth. And in that world of shifting seasons and wandering paths, one of the most important turning points arrived not with the discovery of fire or metal, but with the sight of a small shape rising from the darkness of soil and decay. A mushroom. It seems like the simplest thing, almost humble to the point of invisibility, soft, silent, emerging overnight without explanation. But for early humans, who lived in constant negotiation with hunger and uncertainty, this sudden appearance carried weight. If you were alive tens of thousands of years ago, every day meant searching for something that could be eaten without harm. There were no maps of edible plants, no inherited lists of safe foods, no written documents explaining what nourishes and what poisons. Knowledge was carried only in memory, in the stories told around a fire, in the warnings whispered from one generation to another. Food was found by paying careful attention to shapes, smells, colors, and the reactions of others. To live was to observe. So imagine a person, someone whose name will never be known, whose bones turned to dust long ago, walking through a forest. They notice something they have never seen before, something that does not move, does not flee, does not resist. Hunger is the most persuasive teacher in the world. When food is scarce, anything unfamiliar becomes a question to be answered. But answering it might require more than curiosity. It might require bravery. To taste something new in that world was to accept risk directly into the body. One bite could nourish, harm, or alter perception in ways no one had words to describe. The first person who tried a mushroom did not know which of those possibilities would come. Yet someone did try, and from that moment, something changed in humanity. The mushroom became part of the shared awareness of the world. People remembered the shape of the cap, the texture of the stem, the smell when broken. They noticed where it grew, in what season, what tree had fallen nearby, and depending on the outcome of that first bite, they remembered whether it was welcomed or feared. What is remarkable is that this was not just survival, it was the beginning of pattern recognition, the earliest form of structured learning. Knowledge became story. Story became guidance. Guidance became culture. From these moments, the foundations of science were quietly laid. There were mushrooms that nourished, and groups learned those as food. There were mushrooms that caused illness, and warnings were etched, not in written law, but in memory, shared with urgency. And there were mushrooms that did something different, something harder to explain. Mushrooms that shifted perception, slowed time, deepened sound, brightened color, or invited visions. To us today, these experiences have chemical explanation. But to early humans, who lived so closely to nature that every sound carried significance, these changes in perception felt like messages. When something appears from the ground after rain, grows from decay, and can influence the mind, how could it not seem connected to forces larger than oneself? Early humans did not divide the world into ordinary and sacred. Everything was part of one movement of life. So a mushroom that changes the mind could easily become a guide, a doorway, a sign that the world was layered and mysterious. Long before organized religion, long before written myths, long before temples, there was the simple sense that the world was alive and speaking. And the mushroom, emerging silently from what once was living, seemed to say that nothing truly ends, only changes. This is the earliest form of philosophy, the understanding that life is a cycle, that endings become beginnings, that decay feeds growth. Without language for it, humans understood that transformation is part of existence. In this way, the mushroom helped shape not just hunger and survival, but how humans thought. The person who learned to recognize safe mushrooms became valuable to their group not because of strength or speed, but because of perception. This is the beginning of specialized roles. Some people were better at tracking animals. Others remembered how to make tools. And some learned to read the forest the way one reads intention in a face carefully, patiently, with full attention. These individuals became the early guardians of knowledge. Their skill in noticing subtle differences meant they could prevent illness, provide food, and possibly guide experiences that felt meaningful. Without calling themselves anything like teachers, healers, or guides, they already were. And the mushroom was the object through which the role took shape. This act of learning from nature without destroying it, of listening before acting, is one of the most human traits we possess. It is what allowed our species to adapt to every environment on the planet. The mushroom, appearing suddenly from the forest floor, demanded that kind of careful observation. It required memory of details, courage to explore what was new, and community to preserve what was learned. Before we ever built a city, before we carved stone, we built networks of knowledge in our minds, knowledge of what grows, what nourishes, what harms, and what reminds us that the world is wider than what our eyes alone can see. Imagine again the person kneeling in the forest, holding something unknown, deciding whether it is worth the risk. That moment is the beginning of curiosity. Not curiosity without consequence, but curiosity that shapes identity. Humanity did not become inventive because the world was easy. We became inventive because the world required courage to understand it. Curiosity has always been brave. Curiosity has always asked us to step where certainty ends. And that first encounter with a mushroom is a symbol of that leap into the unknown. This is where the story of mushrooms and humans truly begins. Not in ceremony, not in medicine, not in cultural symbolism, but in the quiet, brave moment where someone looked at the world and thought, what if I try? What if I learn? And from that question, our relationship with knowledge itself began to form. The mushroom may be small, but the insight it invited is enormous. To understand the world, we must be willing to explore it, even when we do not yet have answers. That spirit is still inside us today. There is a moment in human history when mushrooms stopped being just something to eat or avoid and became something more. Not an object of hunger, but an object of meaning. This did not happen quickly. It unfolded over generations. As small groups of people living close to the land began to notice that certain mushrooms did not simply nourish the body or cause illness, but shifted the mind in ways that were difficult to describe. When someone ate these mushrooms, the world did not look the same. Sounds took on new tones. Colors deepened. The boundary between memory and imagination became thin. Time felt slower, or wider, or strangely layered. And in a world without screens, without artificial lights, without noise, drowning out silence, such changes were impossible to ignore. The forest itself seemed to breathe differently in those moments. The wind spoke in pattern. Shadows took shapes that resembled stories waiting to be told. A person under the influence of such mushrooms did not merely feel different, they experienced the world as if it had opened a hidden door. The ordinary seemed full of messages. Stones, trees, stars, firelight, faces, all of it appeared to be speaking with an intelligence that had always been present, just beyond perception. For early humans, this was not entertainment. It was not escape. It was revelation. To experience the world with heightened perception in a time when survival depended on attention was overwhelming, but it was also profoundly meaningful. It suggested that reality was not flat and singular, but layered, mysterious, and alive. That there were unseen forces shaping what could be touched and known. And because early humans lived in close relationship with the rhythms of nature, these experiences shaped how they understood their place within that larger system. Imagine a night thousands of years ago. A small fire in a clearing, surrounded by darkness so deep it feels endless. People sit close together, sharing warmth. They tell stories of ancestors and spirits, of animals they hunted and storms they survived. Suddenly, someone begins to speak of visions, a river that glowed like starlight, a stag made of smoke, a voice emerging from the center of the fire, though no one moved their lips. Others listen, not with disbelief, but with recognition. They, too, have felt the world speak in ways beyond ordinary sight. They know that these experiences are not accidental, they are doorways. This is the moment when mushrooms begin to move from the realm of survival into the realm of the sacred. Some mushrooms became associated with guidance, others with healing from emotional wounds or grief. Some became linked to marking transitions, births, comings of age, mourning, the changing of seasons, the crossing between one life stage and another. And as these associations deepened, certain people within a group began to specialize not only in identifying these mushrooms, but in understanding the experiences they produced. These individuals became early spiritual guides, not priests in the modern sense, not mystics in temples, but people who learned how to accompany others through altered states of consciousness and safely return. Their role was not to claim power, but to hold responsibility. Because these experiences were intense, they required care. Guidance ensured that the altered state did not turn into fear or confusion or despair. With guidance, the experience could become meaningful, grounding, transformative. This is the earliest form of what we now call ritual. The ritual, in its original form, is not about rules or hierarchy. It is about preparing the mind and the body to encounter the unknown without being overwhelmed. It is a way of signaling we are entering a different mode of experience now. Firelight softens the edges of the world. Drums or chanting or quiet breathing provide rhythm. The presence of others provides safety. And the mushroom, taken with intention, becomes a key that opens perception. What is remarkable is how similar these patterns became across cultures that never met. In caves in prehistoric Europe, there are paintings that show figures dancing with shapes resembling mushrooms as if they are not merely objects but companions or teachers. In the highlands of Mesoamerica, there are stone carvings and codices showing mushrooms being used in ceremonies designed to communicate with ancestors or gods. In the snowy regions of Siberia, there are traditions of gathering brightly colored mushrooms that create waking dreams and sharing them in winter rituals meant to help people face long darkness. These are not isolated coincidences. They are examples of how human consciousness responds to certain chemicals in predictable ways, and how humans interpret that experience based on their cultural. But across all of these places, there is a common thread: the belief that the world is layered, and that mushrooms make those layers visible. Not as fantasy, but as insight. The person who sees visions is not thought to be imagining things. They are believed to be seeing something real, something usually hidden. And because these experiences can be shared within a group, they become socially meaningful rather than private. They become stories. Those stories become myth. And myth becomes a way of understanding the world, not just as a physical place, but as a place filled with intention, pattern, and meaning. This is the birth of spiritual interpretation. Not in temples, not in scriptures, not in philosophical texts, but in silence, in forests, in firelight, in the body itself. It is important to say that these experiences were not always dramatic. Sometimes they were gentle, like seeing the world breathe. Like noticing that everything feels connected, like understanding that you are not separate from the forest, the soil, the sky, the others around you, that your life is woven into something much larger than your own individual story. In this sense, mushrooms taught early humans one of the most profound lessons any culture can hold, that perspective can shift, that the world is shaped by how we look at it, that what we believe influences what we can see. These experiences did not just change individual perception, they changed how entire communities understood reality. They influenced how people mourned, how they celebrated, how they explained dreams, how they approached illness or emotional pain. They shaped art, story, myth, and identity. Which means that mushrooms were not simply substances found in nature. They were catalysts, moments where the boundary between the visible and invisible world became permeable. And humans, being meaning-making creatures, shaped entire cultural worlds from that threshold. The mushroom became a teacher, not in the way of words, but in the way of experience. There are regions of the world where winter is not simply a season, but a presence that shapes the rhythm of every life. In the northern reaches of Siberia, where snow stretches across open tundra and the sun, in the coldest months, barely touches the horizon, people learned long ago that survival is not just a matter of strength, but of understanding the land with patience and memory. Here, among vast forests of birch and pine, Another chapter in the story of mushrooms began one that would influence ritual, symbolism, storytelling, and the very understanding of how the human mind relates to the world. In these northern regions grows a mushroom that is instantly recognizable, a bright red cap dusted with white. To many today, it looks like something from a storybook illustration, almost too vivid to be real. But to the people of Siberia, this mushroom was not decoration. It was a teacher, a messenger, and sometimes a doorway. Today, we know this mushroom as Amanita muscaria. It is not the same as the mushrooms that nourish the body or the ones associated with quiet, altered perception in other cultures. Amanita is potent, unpredictable, and requires careful handling. Without guidance, it can cause confusion or distress. But in the hands of those who understood it, it became something structured, intentional, and deeply meaningful. To understand why this mushroom became important here, we must remember the landscape. Winter in Siberia is long, dark, and isolating. The world becomes quiet, and daily life slows. In such an environment, rituals that help maintain emotional and communal balance become essential. The mushroom did not simply alter someone's experience, it offered a shift in perspective at times when the world felt overwhelming or heavy. But this was never practiced casually. The people who guided these experiences were specialists, individuals who dedicated years to learning how the mushroom behaves when it should be gathered, how to prepare it, and how to support someone through the experience. These individuals were the early shamans of the region. The word shaman is often used too broadly today, but in Siberia, its meaning is grounded in responsibility. A shaman's role was to maintain the balance between the visible and invisible aspects of life. Not to control, but to listen and interpret. The mushroom, when understood properly, helped with this work. It allowed the shaman to perceive emotional and symbolic landscapes with depth, to understand grief, fear, illness, or conflict, not as isolated events, but as threads woven into the story of the community. However, Amanita was never taken lightly. Its effects could be intense, and so the knowledge surrounding it became refined through generations. One of the most remarkable aspects of this tradition involved the reindeer that lived alongside these communities. Reindeer are drawn to Amanita mushrooms and often eat them in the wild. Observing this behavior, people noticed that the reindeer would behave differently afterward, moving more playfully, perhaps more alert or energized. This observation led to an understanding. The reindeer's body processed the mushroom in a way that softened certain harsh physical effects while preserving the shift in perception. This led to a practice where, instead of consuming the mushroom directly, people sometimes consumed the urine of reindeer that had eaten it. This allowed the experience to be guided, moderated, and safer. To modern ears, this may sound strange, but within the context of the landscape, it was practical knowledge born from careful observation. Survival in harsh climates depends on learning from every living being that shares the environment. In this sense, the reindeer became co-teachers in the relationship between humans and mushrooms. The lesson here was not only about chemistry or safety, it was about respect. The mushroom is powerful. If you rush, it overwhelms. If you approach with patience, it reveals. When someone in the community entered a guided experience with the mushroom, they were not left alone. The shaman remained present, offering grounding through rhythm drumming, chanting, steady breathing. The sound acted as an anchor, a reminder that even as perception shifted, they were not lost. The goal was not escape, not spectacle, not entertainment. The goal was to see something that might help bring healing, insight, or renewal back to daily life. The experience was always followed by conversation, a processing, a way to bring meaning into memory rather than letting it fade into confusion. These rituals did something profound. They brought people closer to the understanding that emotion, imagination, and reality are not separate planes, but parts of one shared experience. The person who returned from such a journey often came back with metaphors. The feeling of the forest breathing with them, the sense that ancestors were not gone but present in the silence, the understanding that grief could be softened through recognition rather than denial. These insights shaped how communities held their histories and supported one another through hardship. Over time, these practices became woven into seasonal rhythms. Winter rituals that marked transitions, rites of passage, times of grief, or times of renewal. The mushroom became associated with the threshold between darkness and light, between one state of being and the next. It symbolized the idea that even when the world seems quiet or still, unseen movements are taking place beneath the surface. Just as the mushroom emerges from hidden networks in the soil, insights emerge from hidden networks in the mind. In this way, the use of the mushroom in Siberia represents not only the development of early spiritual practice, but also the deepening of human psychological awareness. The people here recognize that the mind is not a closed space, but something that responds to environment, rhythm, and connection. They understood that healing does not only come from physical remedies, but from experiences that allow a person to see themselves within a larger story. This is not mythology in the sense of fabricated tales. It is mythology in the sense of shared, meaning a language for what it feels like to be human in a vast, cold, beautiful world. And in that context, the mushroom was not a trick or a danger. It was a teacher. Even today, long after many of these traditions have changed or faded, their echoes remain in winter stories, in symbols of renewal, in the idea that insight often comes from unexpected sources. The image of the red cap in snow carries with it the memory of a time when humans did not separate the spiritual from the natural, the emotional from the physical, or the self from the world. It carries the reminder that there are layers to our experience waiting to be understood, and that, with careful guidance, patience, and respect, there are ways to see more deeply into the life we are already living. The story of Amanita in Siberia is ultimately a story of relationship between humans and landscape, between experience and interpretation, between fear and curiosity. It teaches that meaning does not arrive from above, but from attention, from listening, and from remembering that even in the coldest, quietest places, the world is alive and speaking. Across the ocean, far from the cold expanses of Siberia, the story of mushrooms took on another form, one shaped not by winter silence, but by dense forests, stone temples, and cities built with astonishing precision. In the ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica, among the Maya, the Mixtec, and later the Aztec mushrooms were not simply natural objects. They were considered sacred threads that linked the world of the living with the world of ancestors and unseen forces. These cultures had already built sophisticated calendars, astronomy systems, writing, and architecture. Their understanding of nature was not accidental. It was the result of thousands of years of close observation. So, when mushrooms were used here, they were not treated casually. They were taken with intention and deep ceremony. In these civilizations, the mushroom was known under names that translated to phrases like the flesh of the gods. The phrase itself tells us something essential. The mushroom was believed to hold a connection to something greater than human life. When consumed during ceremony, it was understood not as an escape from reality, but as a doorway into the true nature of existence, something that ordinary, daily awareness could only see in fragments. To understand how this worked, imagine a temple courtyard at twilight. The day is ended, and the air is cooling. Incense burns, its scent curling upward like a whisper to the sky. A group gathers quietly. There is no spectacle, no crowd. Only those who are prepared to enter this experience are present, and guiding them is a priest or spiritual caretaker who is trained for years to understand how to lead others safely. The mushrooms are placed on a woven mat, small, brown, unassuming. Yet everyone present knows that what will follow is not simple. The participants eat slowly, with respect, and wait. There is no rush. The shift, when it begins, does not feel like something being added to the world. It feels like something hidden is gradually being revealed. Patterns on carved stone seem to move as though alive. The flicker of flame becomes layered with meaning. The air itself seems to carry messages, but it is not chaotic. It is held in structure-guided breathing, rhythmic chanting, the steady pulse of drums or rattles that keep the experience anchored in community. To the people here, this was not understood as imagination or illusion. It was understood as seeing more clearly. They believed the world humans normally perceive is like the surface of water. It shimmers, reflects, conceals. But beneath, there is depth. The mushroom allowed the mind to sink beneath that surface, not to escape life, but to understand it more fully. Stories from these cultures speak of communicating with ancestors during such ceremonies, not in the sense of hearing literal voices, but in the form of memory, insight, emotional understanding. A person grieving a loved one might feel the presence of comfort. Someone struggling with fear might see it not as something to run from, but as something to understand. A leader might gain clarity on how to guide the community. A healer might understand the emotional roots of illness. The mushroom was not the source of wisdom, it was the key that unlocked access to it. And importantly, this was not a solitary experience. The ceremony was designed to be shared. The presence of others provided safety. The songs provided rhythm. The architecture of the temple itself was part of the setting designed to amplify sound and echo, shaping the experience into something cohesive. This is the origin of what we now call set and setting. The understanding that internal experience is shaped by environment and intention. The mushroom served as a teacher, but the culture built the classroom. There were also moments when the mushroom was used for large communal ceremonies, during transitions, new leaders taking responsibility, the beginning of harvest, collective mourning after loss. These gatherings were not escapes. They were renewal. They affirmed that the community's strength did not come only from labor or power, but from shared meaning and shared consciousness. The experiences allowed individuals to feel that they belonged not just to a family or a town, but to a universe that was interconnected and alive. Art from these civilizations reflects this layered view of reality. Glyphs show humans with wide, watchful eyes, surrounded by spirals and woven patterns that resemble movement, breath, and water. Sculptures depict beings that seem part human, part animal, part divin. These works are not fantasies. They are attempts to translate experiences of expanded perception into form. The ceremonies were also deeply ethical. Care was taken to prepare both mind and body. Fasting or quiet reflection often preceded the experience. Participants were encouraged to enter with clarity of purpose, not to seek thrills, but to seek understanding. And the mushroom was treated as something that could both heal and reveal, depending on the intention brought to it. This level of care shows that these cultures understood the mind not as something to be controlled externally, but as something to be guided gently and respectfully. When outside forces later arrived in these lands, they misunderstood these practices entirely. They interpreted them through fear, labeling them as dangerous or chaotic. But the truth is that these ceremonies were among the most structured, thoughtful, and community-grounded uses of altered consciousness in world history. These traditions show a society that did not fear the depths of the mind, but knew how to explore them with reverence. The lesson of Mesoamerican mushroom practice is not about the mushroom itself. It is about the relationship between perception and meaning. These cultures remind us that the mind has many layers, and that wisdom does not always come from expanding outward into conquest or accumulation, but sometimes from closing the eyes, breathing deeply, and looking inward. The mushroom here did not create visions. It reminded people of what was already within them. And perhaps that is the deepest message these cultures carried, that there is a part of the human experience that is always connected to something larger, something ancient, something shared, something that does not disappear even when the world around us changes, something that remains. If the Mesoamerican world saw mushrooms as bridges between humans and the divine, ancient Egypt gave that connection a royal shape along the Nile. Where civilization rose from river silt and sunlight, mushrooms carried meanings tied to immortality, rebirth, and the sacred authority of pharaohs. To the Egyptians, the world was full of symbols. Every plant, every star, every ritual gesture held layers of meaning. Life was always more than what could be touched. It was also what could be understood through myth, memory, and metaphor. Within this worldview, mushrooms were not simply food or medicine. They were embodiments of the divine cycle that governed everything in the Egyptian universe. In the lush floodplains after the Nile's seasonal swell, mushrooms appeared suddenly emerging overnight from rich, dark soil. They seemed to come from nowhere, without seeds, without warning. For the Egyptians, who saw meaning in origin, this was extraordinary. A thing that comes from nowhere must come from the realm beyond ordinary life. And because mushrooms rose quickly and decayed quickly, they embodied the cycle that Egyptians recognized everywhere: birth, death, transformation, renewal. This cycle was one of the central pillars of their worldview. The sun rose and set. The Nile flooded and receded. A pharaoh died and became a god so that another would rise. Mushrooms mirrored these rhythms with elegant simplicity. It was this symbolic power, not just their physical presence, that led Egyptians to associate mushrooms with Osiris, the god of life, death, rebirth, and vegetation. To eat something linked to Osiris meant, symbolically, to participate in the divine pattern of renewal. In other words, mushrooms were considered too sacred, too powerful, to be used casually. This reverence was expressed in law, ritual, and social structure. Mushrooms were reserved primarily for royalty and priesthood. Common people could see them in the fields, but they were not permitted to eat them. This was not simply about control, it was about meaning. Being the pharaoh was believed to be the axis between the earthly and the divine. If mushrooms were the food of immortality, as some ancient texts imply, then they were meant for those whose bodies and souls were already understood as bridging worlds. By consuming mushrooms, priests and rulers participated in the symbolic nourishment of the divine spirit, reinforcing the idea that leadership was not just administrative, it was sacred. We can imagine a ritual setting, a dimly lit temple hall, incense drifting in coils toward hieroglyph-covered walls. Priests move slowly, chanting, hands steady. A small bowl of mushrooms rests beside lotus petals and honey. This is not a feast, it is an offering. The mushrooms are taken not to entertain or distract, but to shift consciousness into a state capable of perceiving the presence of the gods. These experiences were quiet, controlled, and guided by layers of tradition. The goal was clarity, not spectacle. There is also evidence suggesting that mushrooms were included in early medicinal practices. Egyptian physicians, who were among the most advanced in the ancient world, created poultices and treatments using fungi for inflammation, digestion, and recovery. Their medical texts did not distinguish between physical and spiritual well-being. To heal the body was to balance the forces of the soul. In this sense, the mushroom was both remedy and symbol, something that restored physical harmony and reminded the patient of life's continual renewal. Yet, like all things in human history, symbols can shift in later eras. Mushrooms also took on a darker meaning in Egyptian-influenced cultures. Their power, the same power that connected them to rebirth, also made them a potential tool of control. When mushrooms appear in stories of political intrigue, they often do so in a cautionary way. The Roman Empire, which deeply admired and borrowed from Egypt, learned how easily something sacred could also become dangerous. The story of Emperor Claudius allegedly being poisoned with mushrooms is just one example of how a symbol of renewal became a symbol of vulnerability. The world of meaning is always double-edged. What can heal can also harm. But returning to the Egyptian heart of the story, what stands out most is not fear, but respect. Egyptians saw the universe as a vast, interconnected system. Nothing stood alone, not a star, not a river, not a human life. Everything echoed something else. The mushroom was a reminder that life did not begin or end where human senses believed it did. It grew from decay, flourished briefly, and then disappeared back into soil. But in doing so, it proved that nothing is lost. Everything is transformed. This belief shaped how Egyptians viewed their own lives. Death was not an ending, it was a transition. The elaborate tombs, the preservation of the body, the funerary texts, all of it was built on the certainty that existence continues in another form. Mushrooms, by appearing from what seemed like lifelessness, offered a small, natural metaphor for this truth. They showed that what seems dormant is still active beneath the surface, that what appears to end is already preparing to return. Even in art, the mushroom's influence appears subtly. The curves of lotus petals, the spiral of certain hieroglyphs, and the stylized shapes in temple carvings echo organic forms of growth and transformation. Egyptian visual language is full of hints of movement between worlds, and the mushroom fits seamlessly into this symbolic landscape. What makes Egypt's relationship with mushrooms distinct is not necessarily how they were consumed, but how they were understood. Here, the mushroom was not just a physical object or a tool to induce altered states. It was part of a cosmology, a worldview that placed human experience within a larger, ongoing cycle. It was a symbol of life's ability to renew itself, to return after disappearance, to emerge from darkness as something vibrant and alive. In this way, the mushroom became a quiet teacher. It reminded those who held power that immortality was not about living forever as an individual, but about joining the endless flow of transformation. And it reminded those who observed from outside that even the smallest, most mysterious form in nature carries a story as immense as the stars reflected in the sacred Nile. When we look back now, thousands of years later, we see not just a plant or a ritual ingredient, we see a reflection of how humans attempt to understand the mysteries of existence. A reminder that throughout history, we have turned to the natural world, not just to feed the body, but to explain the soul. And the mushroom, humble and quiet, was one of the first guides in that journey. If Egypt wrapped mushrooms in silence and royal secrecy, ancient Greece wove them into ritual mystery, hidden not behind palace walls, but within ceremonies so profound that speaking of them aloud was forbidden under punishment of exile or death. The Greeks approached the unknown with curiosity, imagination, and philosophical wonder. They questioned everything: the nature of life, fate, meaning, the soul. And among their most revered traditions was a quiet ritual that drew thousands from all levels of society: farmers, rulers, scholars, soldiers, and poets. This ritual was known as the Eleusinian Mysteries. To understand the mysteries, it helps to picture Greece not as ruins of pale marble, but as a living place of bright sun, rugged hills, olive groves, and the sound of waves. Philosophy was not distant or abstract, it was woven into everyday life. Questions of life and death were not academic, they were human. And in this world, the border between reality and the sacred was thin. The mysteries were centered around the myth of Demeter and Persephone, the story of a mother's grief, the changing seasons, and the promise that life returns after disappearance. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the grain, was taken to the underworld. Demeter's sorrow caused the earth to wither. When Persephone returned each year, spring followed. The myth explained the cycles of nature, but it also gave shape to something deeper, the hope that death is not an ending. The mysteries took place in Eleusis, a small town near Athens. They were not exclusive. They were open to men and women, citizens and foreigners, rich and poor. But participation required preparation, fasting, reflection, a willingness to leave behind everyday concerns. It was not entertainment. It was transformation. At the heart of the ceremony was a drink known as kykeon, a simple mixture of barley, herbs, and water. But many historians believe the barley was not ordinary. It may have been infected with a fungus that produced a compound similar to what modern science uses to create certain sensory-altering substances. If this was true, then the Greeks were not just telling the story of Demeter and Persephone, they were stepping into it. Imagine the scene. Thousands of participants walk together by torchlight from Athens to Eleusis along the sacred way, a procession through roads, olive fields, and coastlines. But the journey is not loud. It is reverent. The march is part of the transformation. Each step is a way of leaving ordinary life behind. At Eleusis, participants gather in a large hall, the telesterion, a place built not for public spectacle, but for shared experience. The air is warm with bodies, flickering with flame. Priests guide the ritual. Words are spoken, but not explained. The ceremony unfolds slowly, like a dream. And at some point, participants drink the kykeon. No records describe what happened next in detail. Silence was part of the rite. Even philosophers like Plato, who witnessed the mysteries, refused to describe them directly. But they told us their effect. They said the mysteries removed the fear of death. Not by denying death, not by offering simplistic comfort, but by revealing something felt, something deeply seen, something understood in the body as much as the mind. Participants spoke of emerging from the experience changed. Life did not feel like a narrow corridor anymore, but something wider, layered, interconnected. They said they had glimpsed truth, not the truth spoken in debate halls, but a truth that came from within. And this is where the story becomes more than history. The mysteries suggest that humans have always sought not just knowledge, but meaning, not just survival, but understanding. The mushrooms, if they were indeed part of the Kaikyon, were not used for escape. They were used to deepen awareness, open a door that everyday consciousness keeps closed. What made the mysteries powerful was not the substance itself, but the structure surrounding it. Ceremony, story, fasting, community, guidance. These elements created a safe space for the mind to explore. Without structure, experience can become chaotic. With structure, it can become transformative. The Greeks were aware of this balance. They did not treat altered states lightly. They taught that insight requires grounding, and that wisdom is only meaningful when brought back to ordinary life. When people left Eleusis, they did not leave with secret instructions or doctrine. They left with a different relationship to existence. Some walked away with renewed hope. Some walked away with courage. Some walked away with peace where grief had once lived. The effect was personal, intimate, quiet. It did not require belief. It required experience. This difference is important. Many spiritual traditions ask people to accept truths. The mysteries did not ask for belief. They offered a way to see. Over centuries, the Eleusinian mysteries continued, drawing thinkers who shaped Western philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius all likely participated. And while they kept the details secret, their writings hint at the impact. They spoke of the soul not as something to fear losing, but as something that belongs to a larger continuity. The ceremony did not claim to explain the universe. It allowed people to feel their place in it. And then, one day, it ended. When the Roman Empire shifted toward a worldview that saw any competing spiritual practice as dangerous, the mysteries were suppressed. Temples were closed. The telesterion was burned. The ceremony that lasted nearly 2,000 years went silent. But silence does not erase memory. Even without documentation, the influence of the mysteries echoes through philosophy, art, psychology, and the modern search for meaning. The idea that consciousness has depths. The belief that understanding can come from experience, not only logic. The recognition that death is part of a cycle, not a wall. All of these ideas, in one way or another, trace back to Eleusis. And perhaps the greatest legacy of the mysteries is the reminder that wisdom is not always loud. Sometimes it is something quiet, internal, and lasting, something that changes how a person walks, speaks, and sees the world. The Greeks did not treat mushrooms as curiosities or dangers. They treated them as teachers. Not teachers that speak, but teachers that reveal. If Greece used mushrooms to illuminate the soul, ancient Rome used them to display status and sometimes to disguise ambition. In Rome, nearly everything in public life was a performance. Wealth, power, reputation, loyalty, even generosity. A dinner was never just a meal. It was a political statement, a gesture of alliances, a demonstration of refinement or dominance. In that world, mushrooms rare, aromatic, and unpredictable became something more than food. They became symbols. To the Roman elite, mushrooms were delicacies, brought to tables with as much pride as rare spices from Arabia or pearls from India. They were savored not for nourishment, but for effect. A plate of mushrooms announced privilege. It said, "I have access to what others cannot touch." So it is not surprising that mushrooms entered the Roman world through kitchens before they entered temples or texts. Banquets among Rome's upper class were theatrical events. Reclining on couches, guests discussed politics, literature, military campaigns, and gossip, while servants circulated with dishes designed to impress. The mushroom's role in these feasts was not subtle. Its presence contributed to the identity of the host. Food was a language, and mushrooms were one of its more elegant expressions. But this beauty came with a shadow. The Romans had a saying, "All mushrooms are edible." once. They knew some were safe, others were lethal, and that the line between the two could be thinner than a blade of a knife. This uncertainty gave mushrooms an aura of danger, an allure that fed both fascination and fear. The same delicacy that delighted guests could end a life, quietly and efficiently. And in a society where power was fragile and ambition was constant, such delicacy became a tool. One story, known throughout Roman history, illustrates this with chilling clarity. The Emperor Claudius, who ruled in the 1st century CE, was known for his modesty and administrative ability, but he was surrounded by intrigue. His wife, Agrippina the Younger, desired power for her son, Nero. And so, according to many historical accounts, Claudius was served a plate of mushrooms, a dish he adored. The mushrooms were beautifully prepared. Their taste was exquisite. And within hours, the emperor was dead. Whether the story unfolded exactly this way will never be fully known. But what persisted in the Roman imagination was the symbolism. Mushrooms could grant immortality in art and ceremony, but they could also take life when ambition demanded. From that moment on, mushrooms were known in Rome as the food of the gods, a phrase layered with irony. The gods, after all, were eternal. Humans were not. But mushrooms in Rome were not only associated with plots and palaces, they also entered the sphere of early medicine. Roman physicians and naturalists, such as Dioscorides, documented fungi in detailed herbal manuals. They categorized species for use in poultices, compresses, and internal remedies. Although their knowledge was incomplete, their intent was clear, nature was a pharmacy, and mushrooms were part of its collection. Some species were used to treat wounds. Others were believed to support digestion, ease discomfort, or restore balance to the body's systems. However, the Romans viewed healing and luxury through a shared lens. Health was a privilege, not a universal right. And mushrooms, whether used in medicine or cuisine, remained tied to status and environment. The poor might forage, but the wealthy curated. Even in religious settings, mushrooms reflected Rome's cultural values. Unlike the carefully guided spiritual experiences of Greece, Roman rituals were more public, structured around empire, duty, and civic identity. Mushrooms did not take center stage in these ceremonies because Rome valued order over introspection. Where Greece looked inward for meaning, Rome looked outward to victory, law, expansion. The mushroom, elusive and unpredictable, did not align with the Roman desire for control. Yet, ironically, the very unpredictability that Rome tried to regulate also mirrored the fragility of Roman power. Empires expand, but they also crack. Leaders rise, but they also fall. Legacies endure, but they also fade. The mushroom, appearing overnight, disappearing just as quickly, became a quiet metaphor for the rhythm of Roman history itself. One day, an emperor feasts. The next, the palace whispers. This duality gave mushrooms a symbolic place in Roman culture, even when they were not explicitly discussed in philosophy or myth. They represented luxury and fragility, delight and danger, refinement and intrigue. And perhaps the most interesting aspect of Rome's relationship with mushrooms is what it reveals about the human condition. Across civilizations, mushrooms shaped experience based on the values and beliefs already present. In Siberia, where survival required connection to the unseen, mushrooms guided vision. In Mesoamerica, where meaning was shared through ceremony, mushrooms deepened community. In Egypt, where eternity shaped identity, mushrooms symbolized rebirth. In Greece, where wisdom was pursued through mystery, mushrooms opened perception. And in Rome, where ambition shaped destiny, mushrooms became currency of pleasure, power, and sometimes of fate. Rome did not ask the mushroom to reveal the universe. Rome asked it to reveal opportunity. And it did. But beneath the politics, the feasts, the stories whispered behind marble columns, there remains something human and familiar. The people of Rome, like the people of every age, were seeking something. Security, reputation, admiration, belonging. And mushrooms, in their own quiet way, became part of that search, not because they changed consciousness, but because they reflected the world that used them. What Rome teaches us is not simply that mushrooms were rare or luxurious or dangerous. It teaches us that the meaning of a thing shifts depending on the values of the culture holding it. The mushroom has no single story. It becomes what the world around it believes it can be. Sometimes nourishment, sometimes medicine, sometimes a door, sometimes an all-ending. In Rome, the mushroom became a mirror, one that revealed both the brilliance and the vulnerabilities of power. If Rome saw mushrooms as symbols of luxury and political risk, ancient China viewed them through a completely different lens, one shaped by philosophy, nature, and the pursuit of balance. In China, mushrooms were not simply food or medicine. They were part of the deeper conversation about life itself, what sustains it, what weakens it, what allows it to flourish, and what allows it to continue beyond the visible world. In this cultural landscape, the most revered mushroom of all was lingzhi, also known today as reishi. To the Chinese, it was not just a plant. It was a presence, a spiritual expression, a sign of cosmic harmony. Lingzhi was believed to promote longevity, clarity of spirit, emotional calm, and inner alignment. In a world where survival was unpredictable and kingdoms rose and fell, the idea of something that brought stability to the body and balance to the spirit carried profound meaning. To appreciate how lingzhi came to occupy such a sacred role, we must understand the worldview of early Chinese philosophy. Unlike the expansion-driven empires of the West, China cultivated its identity around harmony between people, nature, and the unseen patterns that govern reality. Life was not seen as a series of random events. It was seen as a flow, shaped by forces like qi, the vital energy that animates all living things. Health was not the absence of sickness. It was the alignment of inner and outer worlds. This perspective gave rise to Taoism, a philosophy that explored how to live in accordance with the natural unfolding of existence. Taoist thought spoke of stillness, simplicity, and the deep rhythms of life that lie beneath the surface of ordinary perception. In this worldview, nature was the greatest teacher. So when lingzhi was discovered growing at the base of ancient trees, on shaded mountainsides, or near places believed to carry strong spiritual energy, it was understood not merely as a plant, but as a message. It was as if the earth itself offered guidance in the form of a mushroom, an invitation to learn how to live more gently, more consciously, more fully. Early records describe emperors sending expeditions to search for lingzhi in remote forests. Herbalists studied it meticulously. Poets praised it in verse. Painters depicted it gently twisting like a cloud or a wave, embodying both strength and softness. Lingzhi was not consumed casually. It was approached with intention, respect, and ceremony. It was brewed into teas, ground into powders, and used to strengthen the body from within, not for dramatic effect, but for long-term cultivation of vitality. One legendary figure associated with the mushroom is Shennong, the mythic emperor and physician said to have tasted hundreds of herbs to understand their properties. According to tradition, Shennong sacrificed himself through these experiments so that others could learn from his discoveries. Lingzhi, he said, was not only beneficial, it was something sacred, a medicine not just for the body, but for the spirit. In Taoist texts, lingzhi is referred to as the mushroom of immortality. This did not necessarily mean everlasting physical life, though some sought that. Instead, immortality referred to a life lived so harmoniously that one's essence continued naturally beyond death, like a flame passed from one candle to another. It was the immortality of continuity, clarity, alignment. Centuries later, in dynasties such as the Han and Tang, lingzhi continued to hold its revered place. Scholars described it in encyclopedias. Monks drank it to support meditation. Artists carved it into jade ornaments worn as spiritual talismans. Wealthy families displayed it in gardens, believing its presence alone nurtured peace and longevity. Meanwhile, other mushrooms found their way into Chinese medicine. Some treated fever, some supported the liver, some soothed the mind. The approach was always the same. Observe nature. Learn from it. Respect it. Chinese medicine did not separate physical and emotional health. They were intertwined. A troubled mind could weaken the body. A weakened body could cloud the spirit. Mushrooms were used not to overwhelm the senses or provoke visions, but to restore balance. They were subtle, slow, steady. This is where China's story of mushrooms differs sharply from the psychedelic traditions elsewhere in the world. Here, transformation came not from ecstatic vision or sudden revelation, but from patience, from daily practice, from the gentle work of aligning oneself to the quiet intelligence already woven into life. In essence, the mushroom was part of a broader question. How do we live well? Not richly, not powerfully, but well, with ease instead of strain, with clarity instead of confusion, with acceptance rather than resistance. In this context, Lingji becomes something even more meaningful. It represents the idea that peace and strength do not come from outside. They come from cultivation of the self, from time, from steady breath, from listening. This perspective shaped more than medicine. It shaped culture, architecture, poetry, calligraphy, cuisine, even the way tea was poured. Everything was touched by the idea that life is an art and health is not an accident. In contrast to Rome's luxury and Greece's revelation, China's relationship with mushrooms was one of continuous practice. The mushroom did not break open the mind. It nurtured it. It did not promise escape. It promised return to oneself, to stillness, to balance. This approach is not only ancient, it persists today. Modern science has confirmed that Lingji contains compounds that support immunity, inflammation, regulation, and stress resilience. Yet even now, these benefits are understood not as magic, but as alignment with the body's own intelligence. The mushroom simply helps the body remember what it already knows, how to heal, how to restore, how to remain whole. Lingji teaches us something timeless, that the search for well-being is not a race. It is a rhythm, one that begins not in striving, but in quiet attention to what is already present. And so, while other civilizations look to mushrooms for visions, power, or prestige, China looked to them for something quieter, but no less profound: harmony. The harmony of breath and body, the harmony of self and world, as the harmony of life with time. A harmony that, once found, needs no display, only practice. While China explored mushrooms through harmony, and Greece sought them through revelation, Persia approached them through knowledge, careful observation, poetry, scholarship, and the quiet desire to understand how the visible world reflects the invisible one. Persia, at the crossroads of empires, deserts, mountains, and fertile valleys, became a place where ideas did not simply exist. They mixed, refined one another, and formed something layered and deeply human. Persian culture held inquiry as a sacred act. To learn was not only practical, it was a form of devotion. The ancient Persian understanding of the world was deeply tied to the balance between light and shadow, clarity and confusion, health and illness, life and decay. Mushrooms, which emerged from places where life had ended and yet signaled something beginning, fit naturally into this philosophical landscape. Persian healers and scholars studied the natural world with meticulous attention. They wrote texts combining observation, experience, and intuitive knowledge. In these works, mushrooms were described not as symbols of mystery or tools of dramatic transformation, but as living medicines, complex, subtle, requiring discernment. The Persian approach was cautious and respectful. It recognized that mushrooms could nourish, harm, or heal depending on context, season, amount, and preparation. They believed that every plant had a temperament, warm or cool, moist or dry, and that every body had a temperament as well. Illness occurred when temperaments fell out of balance. Mushrooms, delicate and changeable, were considered to influence internal states in powerful ways. Some were used to soothe fevers, others to strengthen the body after long sickness. Others were applied to the skin to support healing. Some were avoided entirely. In this way, Persia's story of mushrooms is not driven by spectacle, but by precision. It mirrors the larger Persian way of seeing the world. Nothing is simple, but everything is connected. The physician must not only know the plant, they must know the patient, their history, their emotional world, their environment. To heal someone, You must understand who they are. And this attention to the inner world led Persia not only toward medicine, but toward mysticism. Mystics in Persia did not seek visions through sudden dramatic alteration of consciousness. They sought clarity through contemplation, poetry, and silence. But they understood that nature reflects truths about the soul. They looked at mushrooms not as gateways to altered realms, but as quiet symbols of transformation. A mushroom grows from decay. The soul grows through hardship. Both rise from what once seemed lost. The mystics spoke in metaphors that were simple but endless in meaning. They described the soul as soil, dark, deep, containing every possibility. They described wisdom as something that grows quietly, often without announcement. They described spiritual insight as something that must be cultivated, watered with patience, sheltered from haste. In this worldview, the mushroom became a subtle teacher, not one that shouts, but one that whispers. It reminded the mystic that the most important transformations happen in silence, that what is unseen is more powerful than what is visible, that decay is not the end of the story. Persian poets understood this intuitively. They spoke of how the heart breaks, and from that break, something tender and new begins to grow. They spoke of how beauty is fleeting, but meaning endures. They spoke of how the world is full of signs, if one learns to look. And while mushrooms did not dominate Persian spirituality the way they shaped the rituals of Siberia or Mesoamerica, they fit into the Persian imagination as quiet symbols of a larger truth. Change does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply appears like a mushroom after rain. The physicians wrote about mushrooms as remedies. The mystics wrote about mushrooms as metaphors. The ordinary people used mushrooms in cooking, careful, attentive, sharing stories of which ones brought comfort and which ones brought caution. Knowledge traveled in both directions, from healer to community and from community back to healer. This circulation created a collective intelligence sustained over centuries. Persia as a place of knowledge exchange, also connected east and west. Caravans traveled across mountains and deserts, carrying spices, silk, tea, minerals, and stories. Along these routes, understandings of mushrooms traveled as well. Chinese reverence for lingji, Indian systems of balancing energies, Greek awareness of symbolic perception, and Egyptian recognition of cyclical transformation. Persia did not simply receive ideas. It digested them, questioned them, integrated them. It transformed them into something uniquely its own. Wisdom is not a flash of light. Wisdom is a steady flame. In this way, the Persian relationship with mushrooms was neither ecstatic, nor political, nor exclusive. It was gentle, attentive, scholarly, poetic, and balanced. It saw mushrooms as something that reveals the quiet intelligence of nature. Nature does not hurry. Yet everything is accomplished. This perspective shaped Persian culture for centuries, leaving subtle traces in herbal medicine, architecture, literature, and the slow unfolding worldview that values patience over conquest, depth over spectacle, and meaning over display. What Persia teaches, through its relationship with mushrooms, is something very simple and very difficult. Healing is not an event. Healing is a process. Transformation does not require drama. It requires attention. A mushroom appears quietly. Wisdom does, too. India, with its monsoon forests, river plains, and Himalayan foothills, has always been a land where nature and thought move together. Here, life has long been understood as something layered and interconnected: body, mind, spirit, environment, memory, and breath, all influencing one another like currents in the same river. The Indian relationship with mushrooms grew from this worldview, subtle, practical, attentive, and grounded in the belief that health is not simply the absence of illness, but the harmony of all aspects of being. Ayurveda, India's ancient system of medicine, did not rise from laboratories or imperial courts. It arose from listening to the body, to the environment, to the patterns of life. Its practitioners observed how the seasons affect hunger, how the mind affects digestion, how emotion affects breath, and how what we take in shapes who we become. In this tradition, every plant, mineral, and food was understood to have qualities warming or cooling, grounding or stimulating, soothing or drying. Mushrooms were included in this great mapping, not as supernatural tools, but as part of the quiet language of nature. Ayurvedic texts speak of mushrooms as substances that can strengthen tissues, support the immune system, and restore vitality when the body has been depleted. But they were also considered heavy, meaning they required a strong digestive fire to process properly. For this reason, mushrooms were not eaten casually. They were used with intention, often for recovery after illness, periods of emotional strain, or times when the inner energy known as prana felt weakened or blocked. This approach reflects a key insight of Ayurveda. Healing is not about force. The body is not a machine. It is a garden, and gardens need tending. India's tropical and mountain regions are rich in fungal life. Villagers, monks, and healers learned to recognize mushrooms that appeared during the rains or near fertile tree roots. They observed how different mushrooms affected digestion, sleep, mood, and clarity. They noticed which ones supported strength in old age, which soothed anxiety, and which brought rest to a restless mind. One type of mushroom in particular became associated with longevity and resilience, chaga-like species and cordyceps that grew at high altitudes. These mushrooms were rare, difficult to harvest, and treasured not because they induced visions, but because they helped restore vitality to those who were exhausted or weakened. In mountain regions, where the air was thin and the body worked harder to breathe, these mushrooms became companions to endurance. They were seen not as shortcuts to power, but as reminders that the body carries wisdom and sometimes simply needs nourishment to remember it. This perspective created a different relationship with mushrooms than in other cultures. There were no grand ceremonies, no ecstatic visions, no myths of divine speech. Instead, the use was steady, almost humble. A tea brewed in the early morning, a tonic given to someone recovering from grief, a warm broth prepared for elders during the colder months. Mushrooms were part of the art of care. Yet India also has a deep tradition of spiritual inquiry, meditation, mantra, ritual, and contemplation. The goal in these practices was not to escape the world, but to see it clearly, to remove the dust from perception, to recognize that the mind is not a hall of mirrors to be feared, but a window that, when cleaned, reveals its connection to everything else. In this context, mushrooms became associated not with dramatic change, but with subtle clarity. They were believed to support the ojas, the essence of vitality that gives a person calm strength, emotional steadiness, and luminous presence. A person with strong ojas does not tire easily. They do not fall into despair quickly. Their voice is gentle but firm. Their eyes are clear. Their presence feels grounding. Mushrooms were used to help restore this quality when life's burdens had worn it down. India also has a long tradition of sages, yogis, and forest ascetics, individuals who lived close to nature not to escape society, but to understand life more deeply. These practitioners were deeply observant. They learned not from texts alone, but from the movement of rivers, the growth of trees, the behavior of animals, and the silence of mountains. For some of them, mushrooms were part of their diet not because they sought altered states, but because they understood nourishment as part of the spiritual path. A mind cannot be steady if the body is weak. A body cannot be strong if the mind is restless. Mushrooms helped support the quiet persistence required for contemplation. This relationship between physical and spiritual well-being is one of the defining characteristics of Indian philosophy. Enlightenment was never imagined as something separate from the body. The body was seen as the vessel through which insight is expressed. And so, supporting the body gently, attentively, was considered part of supporting the soul. The Indian story of mushrooms, then, is one of patience. No grand visions. No dramatic revelations. Just slow, steady cultivation of vitality and clarity. A recognition that life unfolds gradually, and that depth comes from consistency, not intensity. This is a lesson that resonates deeply today. In a world that often values speed, stimulation, and immediate transformation, the Indian approach reminds us that true change is quiet. It is slow. It happens over time. through daily choices, through breath, through rest, through nourishment. A mushroom appears quietly in the forest. Healing appears quietly in the body. Insight appears quietly in the mind. The same pattern, repeated everywhere. In this way, India's contribution to the story of mushrooms is not about what mushrooms do to us, it is about how we meet them, with respect, with patience, with awareness that life's deepest movements do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they simply grow. The Indian relationship with mushrooms teaches something gentle but enduring. Strength does not always look like force. Transformation does not always look like awakening. Sometimes strength is simply the ability to continue. Sometimes transformation is simply the return to oneself. In medieval Europe, the story of mushrooms took a very different turn. Where other cultures saw mushrooms as medicine, guides, or symbols of renewal, Europe came to see them through the lens of fear, uncertainty, and the struggle to understand forces that felt unpredictable. The landscape itself shaped this story. Thick, damp forests full of shadows, long winters that stretched hope thin, villages separated by miles of wilderness, and a worldview in which everything unknown was believed to be influenced by invisible forces, some benevolent, others deeply feared. Life in medieval Europe was governed by two powerful frameworks, the church and survival. People depended on the land for food, and yet the land was not always generous. Crops failed. Winters were harsh. Disease moved silently through villages. And when misfortune struck, there were few explanations that felt within human control. In such a world, anything that appeared suddenly, without clear origin, could easily be interpreted as belonging to forces beyond human understanding. Mushrooms fit this description almost perfectly. They sprang from the earth after rain, sometimes overnight, as though they had emerged from another world. They grew on tree stumps, in graveyards, along forest edges, and in the damp corners of barns. Some nourished, some sickened, some killed swiftly and without warning. Without botanical science, these patterns were difficult to explain, and what cannot be explained is often feared. So mushrooms, instead of becoming part of everyday medicine or spiritual practice, became associated with mystery and danger. Villagers learned not only which mushrooms were edible, but which ones were forbidden, not simply because they were poisonous, but because they were seen as belonging to someone else. To the spirits of the forest, to the fair folk, to something ancient and unnamed. Stories began to form, stories told around hearth fires, in hushed tones, when night thickened and the wind pressed against wooden shutters. People spoke of fairy rings, circles of mushrooms that appeared in meadows or forests. To step inside one, they said, was to step into another realm. Time would shift. A moment inside could mean years outside. One might return, changed, confused, or not return at all. In these stories, mushrooms were not simply plants. They were thresholds. This way of thinking was not foolish or superstitious, it was symbolic. The world felt full of forces that shaped life in ways no one could see. Illness, recovery, dreams, sudden emotion, intuition. These experiences were interpreted through metaphor. The mushroom, appearing without explanation and altering the body when eaten, became a symbol for the thin boundary between the seen and unseen world. But medieval Europe was also a place where fear could take form quickly. And when fear grows, it often seeks something or someone to blame. During the centuries when accusations of witchcraft spread across Europe, mushrooms became part of the imagery associated with those believed to be in contact with otherworldly forces. People began to whisper that witches used mushrooms to create potions, salves, or brews that allowed them to fly or speak to spirits. These were stories born not from first-hand knowledge, but from fear of those who did not fit neatly into village structures: midwives, healers, herbalists, women who lived alone, or those who simply carried a presence that others did not understand. Healers who had learned which mushrooms eased pain or soothed fever found their knowledge increasingly dangerous to hold. A skill that once meant care became associated with suspicion. And so, knowledge that had been passed quietly through families and communities began to fade, not because it was false, but because it had become unsafe. This fear did not only shape beliefs, it shaped culture. Medieval art depicted witches on broomsticks surrounded by mushrooms. Folktales warned children never to touch certain mushrooms or step near fairy ring. Stories spread of travelers losing their way after eating the wrong mushroom. Even after the scientific revolution began, suspicion lingered. Mushrooms were rarely celebrated in European cuisine, medicine, or ceremony compared to other cultures around the world. They occupied a liminal space known but not trusted, present but avoided. Yet, within the shadows of fear, there was also something deeply human. The stories of fairy rings, enchanted forests, and unseen presences reflected a longing to understand the mystery of existence. People sensed that the world contained layers beyond the everyday, but without a tradition of guidance or ceremony to explore that awareness, it became easy for curiosity to transform into caution. And so, in Europe, the mushroom did not become a teacher. It became a warning. Not because mushrooms were inherently dangerous, but because the cultural mind of the time could not imagine the unknown as something to approach with openness. The world was too uncertain. Life was too fragile. The unknown needed boundaries. This chapter in the story of mushrooms reveals something essential about human nature. The way we interpret the world is shaped by the emotional climate of our lives. When life feels stable and cared for, the unknown becomes something to explore. When life feels precarious, the unknown becomes something to fear. Even today, traces of the medieval European relationship with mushrooms remain. Many people still associate mushrooms primarily with risk. Many remain cautious, unsure, hesitant to forage or experiment. The fairy ring still appears in children's stories. The association between mushrooms and witches still echoes through folklore and popular imagination. But just as fear can be passed down, so can curiosity. And over time, as the world changed, Europe began to rethink mushrooms, not as symbols of danger, but as organisms worth understanding. This shift would come later, during the Renaissance and beyond. But in the medieval period, mushrooms embodied something powerful, that the world holds more than we can see, and that how we respond to that truth shapes who we become. By the time Europe entered the Renaissance, something subtle began to shift. Curiosity, which had once been overshadowed by fear, started to reawaken. The world was changing, cities were growing, trade routes expanding, and new ideas crossing borders more quickly than ever before. Books, once rare, became more common. Observation began to take its place beside tradition. And in that slow transformation, the mushroom, long a symbol of caution, began to be seen differently. The Renaissance was a time when people started to look closely at the world itself, rather than relying solely on inherited interpretation. Artists studied anatomy. Navigators mapped coastlines. Astronomers watched the movement of stars. And naturalists turned to plants, animals, and the land, not as symbols, but as living systems to be understood. Mushrooms, once considered strange or dangerous, drew the attention of these observers. They sketched them, described them, compared their shapes, and sought to understand why some nourished while others harmed. Yet even then, mushrooms remained difficult to categorize. They did not behave like plants. They had no leaves, no flowers, no seeds, but they were not animals either. They appeared from decay and vanished quickly, for centuries. Even the most intelligent scholars did not know how mushrooms reproduced. Some believed they formed spontaneously, born from moisture or rot. This mystery fascinated early scientists. They dissected mushrooms. They dried them, preserved them, cataloged them. But the breakthrough that truly changed understanding did not come until the invention of the microscope in the 17th century. When naturalists peered through glass and magnified the invisible, they began to see that mushrooms were connected to vast networks, threads like roots beneath the ground, interwoven with soil, wood, and plant life. These threads, which we now call mycelium, revealed that mushrooms were not isolated organisms. They were part of a hidden structure far larger than what anyone could see. The mushroom, it turned out, was only the fruit. The organism itself lived underground, linking trees, soil, and decay into one continuous system. This discovery marked a turning point. Mushrooms were no longer symbols of the unknown. They became keys to understanding the entire cycle of life. As scientific knowledge expanded, classification systems were created to organize the natural world. Plants in one category, animals in another. But mushrooms resisted easy placement. They absorbed nutrients differently. Their bodies were structured differently. Their relationship to the environment was different. And so, gradually, scientists came to understand that mushrooms belonged to their own kingdom, fungi, a form of life, neither plant nor animal, but something entirely itself. This recognition opened new questions. If fungi were everywhere underground, in air, in living bodies, then they were not peripheral to life. They were central. They broke down fallen leaves and old trees, returning nutrients to the soil. They repaired ecosystems, supported plant roots, and helped forests communicate chemical and electrical signals through intertwined networks. What had once been seen as the symbol of decay was now understood as the architect of renewal. From here, the story unfolds rapidly. Medicine discovered that certain fungi produce compounds that can fight bacterial infections, penicillin being the most famous. This changed the course of human history, saving millions of lives and altering the way healing was understood. Fungi also played key roles in fermentation, agriculture, environmental repair, and food traditions across the world. Yet, even as science illuminated the biological reality of mushrooms, something else remained, something older, quiet, and human. The mushroom had always been more than biology. It was a companion to our imagination. Even as laboratories advanced and microscopes improved, people continued to form personal relationships with mushrooms. Foragers passed down knowledge through families, where to look, how to gather, how to prepare food with attention and gratitude. Artists painted mushrooms in forests touched by morning light. Dreamers walked through woods and remembered the stories of fairy ring. Healers and spiritual practitioners returned to mushrooms not for dramatic visions, but for grounding clarity, emotional restoration, and renewed sense of belonging to the natural world. And in the last decades, mushrooms have re-emerged into global awareness, not as objects of fear, but as participants in human well-being. Scientists study how certain mushrooms support mental health and emotional resilience. Ecologists study how mycelium can restore damaged soil and ecosystems. Architects explore mushroom-based materials to build sustainable structures. Chefs create dishes that bring together nourishment and artistry. The mushroom, once avoided or misunderstood, has become a symbol again, but now of connection. Connection to the earth. Connection to memory. Connection to the unseen networks that hold life quietly together. And so the story comes full circle. Before civilization, mushrooms taught us curiosity. In ancient cultures, they became guides of meaning. In medieval times, they reflected our fears of the unknown. In the Renaissance, they inspired question. In the modern era, they revealed the hidden architecture of nature. And today, once again, they invite us to pay attention to see that life is not made of separate parts, but of relationships. A mushroom is small, silent, and temporary, but it appears at the exact moment the forest is ready. It reminds us that endings feed beginnings, that decay is not destruction but transformation, that the world grows from what it once was, always in motion, always renewing, and that we, too, are part of that cycle. So, when we look back across this long journey, from the first early humans kneeling in forests, to the Maya temples and Siberian winters, to Egyptian tombs, Greek mystery halls, Roman banquets, Chinese mountain paths, Persian poetry, Indian healing, and medieval firesides, we see that the mushroom was never just a small organism growing from the soil. It was a mirror, a reminder of how humans try to understand life. Sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with ceremony, sometimes with fear, sometimes with study, but always with the same question in our hands. What does it mean to be alive in a world we do not fully understand? And the mushroom shows us something simple and yet endlessly deep, that growth often begins where something else has ended. That transformation happens quietly. That the world beneath our feet is full of networks we rarely notice. And that sometimes the things that appear smallest are part of something vast. If there is a lesson that threads through every culture, every era, every story we have touched tonight, it might be this. There is more to reality than what meets the eye, and we are always learning how to see. Thank you for spending this time with me, traveling through forests, temples, deserts, libraries, kitchens, and mountains, all through the quiet presence of one humble life form, wherever you are. I hope the world feels just a little wider than before, and a little more connected. And maybe the next time you see a mushroom on a walk, or in your kitchen, or rising from damp soil after rain, you will pause not to classify it, not to fear it, but simply to notice that it is there. Quiet, patient, ancient, asking nothing, offering everything. I will see you again in the next story. Good night. And take gentle care of yourself.